Welcome everyone to our webinar. Welcome everybody to our webinar. We give it a minute just to give people the chance to dial in, and we'll start shortly. All right, we see a lot of attendance, so I would propose we get started. First of all, big welcome and thank you so much for joining us today to our fifth webinar in this series on HREDD, in particular in the context of the German Supply Chain Act. So today's webinar focuses on stakeholder engagement and involvement of rights holders in HREDD. And it's a webinar series that we're co-hosting with our partner, the German Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, and also with the support of the German Help Desk on Business and Human Rights. My name is Franz Hilmer, Stakeholder Engagement Advisor at Amfori. So I am going to run you through this webinar today, together with Isabel Reichenbach from the German PST, quickly run you through some housekeeping rules. So just starting off, you will all be muted as participants, and you can post your questions in the Q&A box, also in the chat box, as you prefer, whatever you find easier. We'll be monitoring both. We'll be recording this session, and we'll also share the recording together with the slides after the webinar. And then we'll also share with you a very brief satisfaction survey afterwards. It would be great if you can fill that in, because it helps us to improve, and ultimately we want to deliver really good webinars for you and good services. So feedback is always much appreciated. So just quickly to run you through the agenda, it's a 90-minute webinar, so 1.5 hours until 11:30. After my brief introduction to the topic, we'll have Michaela Streibel, advisor at the Help Desk on Business and Human Rights. She'll be speaking about the German Supply Chain Act, specifically, of course, on the aspect of stakeholder engagement, involvement of rights holders in the due diligence process. Then we turn to some more practical tools and approaches on the topic. So I will be giving an introduction to that from the Amfori's perspective. So what tools do we offer in this regard? Then we have Sanne Gerritze from We Fashion. So she will be presenting their approach on the topic. Thanks, Sanne, for joining us today. And also Isabel Reichenbach from the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, who will be then also moderating the second Q&A session and do the closing remarks today. So thanks again to all our speakers for joining. And let me start just briefly with a broad overview of Amfori, I see there's a lot of stakeholders in the room as well. So I would just like to kind of remind you of who we are, what's our vision and mission and profile of the organization. So we're a leading business association for sustainable trade, empowering companies across the globe to operate successful and responsible businesses by helping them to improve the environmental, social, and governance performance of their value chains. Now we have 2,400 members. It's retailers, brands, importers that basically use our platform to map their supply chains. So they have around 40,000 producers that they've mapped on our platform. And together we offer them kind of an infrastructure to collaborate in the due diligence context. We also, as part of that toolbox, offer social audits, environmental audits, and so on. We have around 35,000 monitorings per year that we carry out. And this happens in more than 100 countries worldwide. This, of course, includes also other sustainability operations such as trainings, consulting services locally in the context of BPI, for example. So there's various different offerings in the context of our main products. So that's Amfori BPI, that's the environmental due diligence scheme. Then we have the social due diligence, probably most known, Amfori BSCI. And then we have our governance pillar, which includes quality management, ESG risk identification, or more broadly, risk management, Amfori Insights, business intelligence, and also Speak for Change, of course, our supply chain grievance mechanism. And these products are all underpinned by capacity building, so by trainings for members and their suppliers, as well as advocacy and engagement, to kind of create a policy landscape and infrastructure that is conducive to sustainable business operations. And the focus for us is really on building capacity and supporting and empowering suppliers to live up to the standards that all the signatories of Amfori Code of Conducts are committed to implement. Now, that's just a snapshot of our membership. I'm not going to go into detail. You can skip that slide. And then let me turn maybe to the topic of stakeholder engagement in the context of due diligence. So stakeholder engagement is really an essential characteristic of due diligence. It's required as part of due diligence. Without it, due diligence cannot happen. Really, it's also, as the OECD guidelines state very clearly, meaningful stakeholder engagement is a key component of the due diligence process. So from embedding responsible business conduct to identifying, assessing adverse impacts, to seizing, preventing, mitigating any adverse impacts, tracking the implementation of your efforts, and then also communicating about them, and then finally, of course, provide remedy and cooperate in this regard to support rights holders' rights are maintained. Next slide, please. Now, just before we move on to Michaela, 2 slides, still I wanted to capture what we're talking about here. So who are stakeholders? So according to the OECD, relevant stakeholders are persons or groups or their legitimate representatives who have rights or interests related to the matters covered by the guidelines that are or could be affected by adverse impacts associated with the enterprise's operations, products, or services. So you have to ask yourself the question, how do I affect certain organizations? Which organizations are we talking about? That's, for example, employees, of course, customers, investors, suppliers, contractors, local communities, and particularly also individuals or groups in situations of vulnerability or marginalizations of vulnerable persons. So that's just some examples of your key stakeholders. And the question, how does your business affect them, whether it's your direct business operations or the products that you bring onto the market. Now, what's very important, considering that, of course, companies have to deal with a lot of bureaucracy also, and a lot of processes and different requirements from different legislations, but also, of course, international standards and so on, customer expectations. So what's very important in this context is to remember that enterprises can prioritize the most severely impacted or potentially impacted stakeholders for engagement. So you're not asked to engage with every stakeholder every step of the way, but to really make sure that you prioritize who you're engaging with and why. And of course, here the degree of impact on stakeholders may inform the degree of engagement as well. Now, what's meaningful and effective stakeholder engagement? So there's some key characteristics that were defined also by the OECD. So one is that it's really ongoing, so that it's not like a one-off thing, but that you really have a process to regularly touch base with that particular key stakeholder. that it's a two-way street, so that you really, allow for dialogue, and that it's not an imposition of your expectations, for example, that it's conducted in good faith, meaning that you are also, or both sides are responsive to stakeholders' views. And so that's ultimately the purpose of it, to understand the stakeholders' needs also, and maybe constraints. And then finally also to ensure that it's timely, accessible, appropriate, and safe for stakeholders in the context of rights holders. That's particularly important, of course, in cases of retaliation for them, speaking up. And of course that things are happening in a way that they have time to react and process the information that is subject to the dialogue. And finally, also to make sure that there are no barriers, or that you identify the barriers that exist and that you remove them. That's particularly relevant in the context of vulnerable stakeholders. Migrant workers, for example, is a good example where, of course, a language barrier might be an issue, but then also generally, if there's no channel for communication with certain groups, then that's an important barrier that requires addressing. I don't want to go much more into detail here, so because Michaela will now also talk a lot about the expectations from a legal perspective in the context of the German Supply Chain Act. So on that note, I hand over to Michaela Schreibelt from the German Help Desk on Business and Human Rights. Michaela, thanks so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Francis. And yeah, without further ado, I'll start with quickly introducing our services to those of you who might not know of us yet. We're free of charge governmental or advisory service provided for by the government. We don't speak for the government, but we provide confidential and free of charge advice to businesses and business associations. We also provide for training programs, assist companies in designing and implementing their own training programs, and have a free of charge e-learning service. I believe the slides will be shared with you later, and you see some of and some points in the slides there's hyperlinks, so feel free to check this out and get in touch with us if this is interesting for you. We participate in events like today, but also have our own event formats and a couple of, in my opinion, very helpful online services that are free of charge as well. So if you're interested in these, please check them out. On the next slide, please. I want to, before I dive into the topic of today, stakeholder and rights holder engagement, take a bit of a broader view on the whole topic in general. And I often debate whether or not to show this slide in the beginning of my presentations, because I'm showing it a lot, but I still believe it's really interesting to have a look at in what political and legal context we're moving around in the context of business and human rights at the moment. And I think it's quite obvious the trend goes towards binding regulation that's connected with sanctions like the German Act, but also like the developments on the EU platform. There's three main approaches that legislators take in relation to business and human rights, at least as of now. Maybe they'll develop further ideas. And these are basically due diligence-based models like the German Act, like the proposed EU directive based on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Then there's some approaches that just implement reporting obligations, like the NFRD and the CSRD are examples of that, but also the Modern Slavery Acts. And then there's a third approach that seems to be becoming more relevant recently, and these work with bans. One example is the EU regulation on a ban on products in relation of deforestation, and then the proposed ban on goods made from forced labor. On the next slide, I want to highlight a couple of key points from the Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act. To many of you, a lot of this will be known already, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but obviously it's important to take everyone on board and make sure everyone is on the same page. The German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act obliges certain companies to implement risk management systems that we like to divide into 6 key elements. Strategy and implementation, risk analysis, preventive and remedial measures, complaints procedure, effectiveness assessment, and reporting. the due diligence obligations exist in the so-called supply chain, which is divided into 3 spheres for the purposes of the Act: own operations, direct suppliers, and indirect suppliers. And in relation to indirect suppliers, obligations only exist when a certain knowledge threshold is met. It's called substantiated knowledge. However, the assumption that the Act only relates to direct suppliers and own operations is false, because the threshold of substantiated knowledge is met relatively easily. And companies obliged under the Act are this year German companies with at least 3,000 employees in Germany, and then next year the threshold will be lowered to at least 1,000 employees in Germany. Next, I want to highlight 3 key principles of the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act on the next slide. And the 2 next slides actually is effectiveness and appropriateness. The Act obliges companies to implement duties of means and not obligations to guarantee that the supply chains are free of risks and violations. And this duty of means, duty of effort is not just any type of effort that companies can show in relation to their due diligence obligations, but is defined by 2 criteria: effectiveness and appropriateness. And effectiveness basically means that what companies are doing must be suitable to meet a certain goal. It's a duty of means. Companies don't have to guarantee, so they don't necessarily have to go all the way towards this goal, but what they're doing must be something that suits meeting this goal. And how far companies then have to go towards this goal, this is defined by appropriateness on the next slide, please. And appropriateness is a little bit more complex. It's not just simply, okay, it must be something that works, but it's something that is defined by a set of criteria that relate to the company's ability, to how risk-prone they are, to how much they can influence the party responsible, to how severe and how likely a violation is in relation to its occurrence, and then also the nature of the causal contribution that this company made towards this violation. And this basically means that in relation to different actors, different supply chains, different own operations, companies have to take a different approach and are forced to be taking a risk-based approach, basically, so not to treat all of their supply chains, all of their suppliers, all of their own operations the exact same way. And pretty much almost all of the obligations under the Act have to be met in an effective and appropriate way. And appropriateness also relates to stakeholder engagement, rights holder engagement, what we'll see in a little bit. So in relation to, for example, a complaints procedure and also rights holder engagement, appropriateness also tells us which criteria to apply when looking at who are the people we have to really engage with, or whom we have to put at the center of our activities. And this rights holder engagement and change of perspective on the next slide, please, is the 3rd key principle from the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act that I want to highlight, because this act basically is all about changing perspective and all about rights holders. The Act requires companies to change perspective away from a traditional risk management perspective that looks at what risks exist to my company that might jeopardize my liquidity, my position in the market, my reputation, so might of some sorts be a problem to my activities, and then change this perspective and look at what risks, what effects do I create to everyone who's around me. And in the context of the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act, not everyone who's around me, but particularly to people who are connected to my activities in my supply chain, because they're somehow connected to my own operations, or they're somehow connected to my supplier in the supply chain. And then obviously take a focus on vulnerable groups and people who are most severely affected by activities. And when we're talking about stakeholders and rights holders, in the context of my presentation, I'll be focusing on rights holders. But next slide, please. Let's take another look at in what context rights holders and stakeholders holder engagement plays a role in the context of the Act. So just like the principles effectiveness and appropriateness, rights holder engagement is at the center of the activities in the context of the risk management system and apply to all the elements of the risk management system. You see that we've put the term due consideration of the interests of affected persons in the center of this model, the circle that we like to use to show how the elements of the risk management system are connected to one another. And due consideration of the interests of affected persons is something that companies have to do not only in relation to designing and implementing the system as such, but also in relation to designing and implementing all of these elements, so in relation to strategy and implementation, in relation to risk analysis, in relation to preventive and remedial measures, in relation to the complaints procedure and the effectiveness assessment, in relation to reporting and communication. There's not much to be done because this is done by a template provided for by the competent authority. And yes, when we're talking about rights holders and stakeholders, obviously the due diligence obligations under the Act can only be implemented when doing both, when involving rights holders. Obviously, this is a legal requirement under the Act in relation to all elements of the risk management system, but obviously companies will not be able to meet their due diligence obligations in the supply chain when not collaborating with other stakeholders. And these stakeholders in particular are companies that are part of the supply chain of obliged companies. So this might be companies who are subsidiaries of obliged companies or their suppliers. And this is something I will not elaborate on in more detail. There's been an event together with Amphori and Partnership for Sustainable Textiles on this topic, and there's a recording of that you find on YouTube. There's also a guidance published together by Helpdesk and BAFA on the topic of collaboration in the supply chain. So if this is a topic of interest to you, please check this out. So when looking at the appropriate consideration of the interests of affected persons, the first thing that I noticed when speaking to companies is that they don't really want to deal with this topic. So it's something that they feel is very, very difficult. And then one question that is pretty much always asked when discussing this with companies is, but whom do we have to talk to? The Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act doesn't really tell you whom to speak to specifically. It says it has to be employees and persons who may otherwise be directly affected by the economic activities of the company. And this could be pretty much everyone. So it could be employees of the company itself, employees of suppliers, it could be neighboring communities. These are the most typical examples. And when looking at supply chains, at global supply chains, this could be a huge number of people. This is basically an unlimited amount of persons that you could be then consulting. And I believe one of the reasons why companies feel so are so careful in relation to this topic or so hesitant is that they feel maybe overwhelmed in relation to defining to whom do they have to actually speak. And in this context, the criteria of effectiveness and appropriateness have to be applied again, as in relation to all other questions of the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act. So you would use in particular the violation-based criteria, severity, likeliness of occurrence, in order to define who are the people to whom you need to be talking to in this context. And then obviously you can take different approaches in relation to the different elements of the risk management system. So it might be helpful to consult different persons and different groups of people in relation to strategy and implementation. It might be interesting to speak to other people in relation to the whole design of your risk management system, rather than when it comes to effectiveness assessment of one particular measure. And the answer to whom you should be consulting in relation to which question is defined on the one hand by appropriateness and effectiveness, but also on the other hand by the nature of the questions you might be asking. So effectiveness assessment in relation to a remedial measure that wants to remedy negative impacts that a company had on a particular community. Obviously, in this context, you should be consulting with members of that community or the legitimate representatives. When it comes to maybe designing a grievance mechanism as such, it might be interesting also to speak to people whom you want to address with this grievance mechanism, but it might also, in addition to that, be interesting to speak to other stakeholders, for example, trade unions or non-governmental organizations who might have expertise in that field. And also it might be interesting in relation to risk analysis, just to give a couple more examples, to speak to people who are affected by these negative impacts, but also might be interesting to speak to organizations on the ground who have lots of expertise in relation to these types of impacts, because you might be accessing information that is maybe otherwise not available to you. This as a quick run through stakeholder and rights holder engagement in the context of the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act. And now I believe we still have a lot of time for questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Michaela. Indeed, we do have a bunch of questions already in the Q&A box here. So I will just address some of them. I also see that there's a hand raised. I would kindly ask you to put your question in the chat, because we have quite a lot of participants. So just to also enable us to manage this webinar on time, I'd appreciate if you can put your question in the chat or in the Q&A box. Ideally Q&A box, but I know people sometimes go to the chat as well. Anyway, so there is the first question here from Jana Mikolash. She would like to know if the German Supply Chain Act also includes downstream supply chain.
I mean, the general understanding, there's some dispute in the legal discussion around that. It seems the majority opinion that downstream is not included. I don't know if you want to dive into this further. I think there's good arguments for at least including downstream in relation to risks that particularly result from the nature of a product or its typical use. But this is my personal opinion. The government and the BAFA understand downstream is not being covered by the Act.
Michaela, then there is another question here on the strategy cycle, and maybe we can go back to that slide, a couple of slides before, one more, this one. The question here is, why is strategy at the end of the cycle? Should it not be at the beginning?
That's a good question. I actually understand this as being the beginning, but maybe it's a question of interpretation of this circle. But I mean, it's kind of the cat bites its own tail, the situation, because you need all of these elements and they're interrelated. It's not only a circle, but there should be lines going through the circle as well. And it all kind of resolves around the risk analysis, actually.
Yeah, indeed. Then we have another question here on the due consideration of interests of affected persons, whether that also includes potentially affected persons.
Yes, absolutely.
And then we have a question here on the German companies or the landscape of companies, and how many of them have formalized human rights advisory councils or have human rights experts included as part of an advisory council. If you have any examples in this regard, is that like something that is widespread, or would you say that it's rather in its infancy and there's few companies that are following that practice? What's your experience?
I mean, obviously I cannot speak to who exactly is doing what, because the conversations we have are confidential and the experience I have is only anecdotal. So I don't have a complete overview over who does what and what is the percentage of companies doing it this way or another. I believe that the bigger company is, they're more likely to be having a committee, and if you have the size and resources to do that, I think there's many good arguments for doing it like that, because you'll be able to have expertise from procurement, you'll have people from HR, maybe you'll have people from quality, other departments that might be relevant in this context, sustainability departments.
Yeah, and maybe another input from my side on this regard. I just participated in a stakeholder dialogue from a large company, and the topic came up also in the context of companies competing for all these human rights experts out there, because of course every company now needs to do this, and there is evidently quite a lack of experts that can provide that guidance. And I think it gets to show that there's also a need for kind of training staff, like it also brought up in the context of the discussion with EFRAG on the reporting standards and all these things, and on reporting expertise. And even EFRAG is bringing in a lot of, or training a lot of people that are coming from accounting, and they're training them on, social and environmental or non-financial reporting related topics, because the expertise just needs to be built. So I don't think it's always about also trying to find experts that are not yet there, or at least not to the degree that we would need them in all these businesses and organizations, but rather also to look at your own resources and train staff to understand the subject, and to really build that knowledge in-house. Another question here is, how should companies think about formalizing and evidencing their stakeholder engagement as part of the HREDD process? Is there any guidance from the German government on this point?
This is a really good question. I mean, to my knowledge, there's no guidance from the German government. There's a little bit of information in the FAQ provided by the BAFA, and the consideration of the interests of potentially affected persons is something that the BAFA actually actively asks for in the context of the questionnaire that has to be used for reporting. And companies, the questionnaire was changed once. So the original one had this question in relation to stakeholder engagement, rights holder engagement in relation to every element of the due diligence system in the context of a set of questions in relation to that element. And now it's all been pulled together into one set of questions where they ask, how have you done this in relation to the design of your risk management system? How have you done that in relation to your strategy? How have you done that in relation to risk analysis, and so on? But there's very little guidance. And I think one of the reasons why it's so difficult to talk about formalizing this is because the companies within the scope of the Act, their supply chains and people whom they need to be talking to consider their interests vary so much from one company to the other. And also it's a similar answer as in relation to how deep do I dive into in the risk analysis in relation to my different supply chains, my different supplier, and so on. I mean, we use the criteria of appropriateness, and then you will find them met differently in relation to different actors, but also from one company to another, whom you're actually consulting now and how much efforts you put into consulting whom doesn't only depend on how strongly the criteria of appropriateness are met in relation to this rights holder group, but it also depends on how the overall playing field of different rights holders you have in your whole map of supply chains. Because if you have a huge group of potentially affected persons where the likeliness and severity are met very little, and then you have one group where it's really clear, okay, they might be affected severely, and it's very likely that this is going to happen. It's very obvious. You need to put all your efforts in relation to consultation to them, but usually it's going to be a bit more of a mixed situation, and this is I think what makes it so challenging for companies. And I believe what is a good idea is similar to the risk analysis, to start mapping potentially affected persons, and then start assigning maybe a color coding to them and look at, okay, who are the people I really need to speak to? And in this context, it's really, really important to not just end your analysis at tier 1, because this is not really helpful.
And I think a good keyword here is, or two good keywords is, one is prioritization, absolutely. And then also, of course, what you said, starting, because I don't think any company is expected to have a super sophisticated, robust approach when they are just starting. But you need to show that you are starting and that your approach is continuously evolving and improving based on your risk assessment and so on. So I think that's critical to remember. There's another question here related to initiatives or external sources that you'd recommend for information on risk related to different products. Maybe just quickly before you respond, Michaela, also draw attention to Amphory's ESG risk identification tool, which is now available to all its members. And this is currently not product-based, but it's an addition that we're exploring. At this moment, it gives information on country-specific risk. But Michaela, maybe you can enlighten us with what kind of initiatives or external sources also that you would recommend for information risk related to products.
I mean, there's a lot of sources and tools out there. I think what's really important, I mean, I cannot make a specific recommendation for not the products that are not freely available. And what I think, though, is important for companies to really look at, what do these tools provide? And one of the things they need is they need to have the necessary information in order to then prioritize. And what I've seen when I looked at dashboards of many tools is that, to me, it was not clear at all how the tool came to the conclusion that this supplier, this supply chain, this country, this product is now put on green or put on red. So that's something I think where many tool providers can improve, and I think companies should also actively ask for this. And they need to do this because they will need to show to BAFA why they made a certain decision to now not investigate this further, or to look at this a bit more in depth. There's one tool that is free of charge that we provide for with 2 other cooperation partners. It's called CSR Risk Check. And I think this is a good tool to start a risk analysis, and it might also be a good tool to use as an auxiliary tool for rights holder mapping. But all these tools obviously have limits. In many cases they will just show what is on the internet, and there's some kind of human rights data gap. We have lots of information from media, from government reports, and reports from non-governmental organizations in relation to certain contexts, in relation to certain industries, in relation to certain countries, but this doesn't exist in relation to all products, all industry branches, and all countries in the world, because this, I believe, has not yet been of interest, and I think we will see a huge increase in this data because companies need it more now and will start to research this more. But this also means that just because you can't find a report in relation to a specific product you're using from a specific country, it doesn't mean that your analysis or also your rights holder analysis and mapping can stop there. So you will need to investigate this further.
You now mentioned one tool already. The next question actually goes along those lines. It's you announced to talk about useful tools. What tools and support do exist? I think this is something that we'll address in the next set of presentations. So I will speak to this, as well as Sanne Gerritsen from WeFashion. They present their practical approach of how they go about it as a company, and then we have also the German PST speak to this. So maybe we park that question, and hopefully it will be addressed throughout our presentations. And of course, this webinar itself, serves as a resource for you afterwards to kind of, re-listen and maybe also check the different products, tools, solutions that we are talking about later on. Now, another question here is, we deliver as a Dutch brand to German big retailers, which are obliged. Are we then an indirect supplier for those clients? So another question to you, Michaela.
I mean, you mean from the perspective of a customer of a German obliged company, you'd be an indirect supplier, but from the perspective, if you're in a direct contractual relationship with a German obliged company, you're their direct supplier, and your suppliers would be their indirect suppliers. But this is something that's more, I think, more going towards the whole context of the webinar we had in the beginning of the year, knock-on effects of the Due Diligence Act. So I think, if you want to look into this further, really check out the BAFA and help desk guidance on collaboration in the supply chain.
Indeed, and I also posted the link to the webinar here in the chat, so we can re-watch that. It's publicly available. It's on YouTube, so you can have a look at examples that we gave here of what it means to collaborate in the context of due diligence. So it's particularly interesting also for how you manage and how you involve your suppliers in due diligence, or how you are involved as a supplier in due diligence of companies that fall within the scope of the Act. Then we have another question here, follow-up question on previous one related to the downstream not being included. How can or should customers be involved in the supply chain responsibility topic?
I mean, in the context of the German Act, there is no requirement to involve customers. You might want to do this for other reasons, but there's really no legal requirement to do that.
And other reasons, for instance, could also be that you may require support from your customers in, meeting certain expectations, because also this is one of the things that they're asked to do in the context of collaboration with their suppliers, is to also provide you with, for instance, training or tools or expertise, or lend you a certain expertise as to how you go about these steps, because of course it's a collaborative effort. And ultimately what guides that collaborative effort is a cost burden sharing approach that should make sure that every company acts according to their means also and to their abilities. And of course, if you have a big customer that has a lot of know-how, a lot of tools, you can, collaborate with them or talk to them about how you can leverage this information as well, and how you can support them also in meeting their the expectations they are faced with. Another question here: can you please talk about prioritizing risks that is required in BAFA reporting? Do we prioritize risk based on the framework of severity and likelihood, or new measures developed for some of the risks, resources allocated to developing new measures from a company perspective, and some risks might already have effective measures in place and hence no resource allocation? Do we leave those out of the prioritization in the reporting? It's a very, very various questions. So I don't know, Michaela, if you want me to repeat it, or if you find it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, when you prioritize risks and violations that you identified in your risk analysis, you apply the criteria of appropriateness. Maybe we can go to this slide. It's a little, I think, too further to the front. One more and one more. No, one more. Sorry. And I mean, the BAFA has a guidance on effectiveness and appropriateness. And what the BAFA says basically is that these criteria have to be considered equally, and that they don't stand in a particularly hierarchy to one another. And when we're looking at risks and violations in the context of risk analysis, the BAFA doesn't really say which of these criteria you're supposed to be using. one of the things that they say is you're not allowed to use these criteria like a set of strainers to say, okay, I first look at those on whom I have influence, and then maybe a big part of my suppliers can be taken out of the analysis, and then I look at, okay, where are the most severe, most likely violations, you know, and then you, in the end, you have only a handful of suppliers left. This is not appropriate. And in legal literature, there are some authors who say that the criteria of appropriateness play a different role in relation to different due diligence obligations. And one of the examples the author gives is, for example, that nature and extent of a company's ability in particular is relevant in relation to strategy and implementation, the design of the risk management system and how many resources are allocated for it, and severity, reversibility, and probability of occurrence of a violation is especially relevant in relation to the appropriate risk analysis and prioritization. And then the ability to influence the party directly responsible for a violation plays a role when looking at potential measures a party, an obliged company can take, because depending on your influence, you might have different measures available to you. And nature of causal contribution, I don't actually remember. I don't think the author said anything in relation to that. Unfortunately, I don't think that BAFA yet takes a stance on this, because we're still in a process where it's a new law. We're still developing administrative practice. There's no jurisprudence out there, but I think it's there are really good arguments for this understanding of the criteria of appropriateness. Also, when interpreting them in light of the UNGP and the OECD guidance, on which the law is actually based. And if you follow this, you would prioritize based on severity, reversibility, and probability of occurrence. When you're now showing this in your reporting to the BAFA, and probably soon we'll know more about how BAFA understands this, and you have deprioritized a risk you have identified because you're already taking measures, this is something that I would explain to BAFA just like this. It's basically, if you have a risk and this risk is minimized to zero, close to zero, there's no need to take further measures, but obviously it's still important to know that there's this risk and you are targeting it with measures. And by taking measures in relation to that risk, you have basically already prioritized it because you are taking measures, but there's no more there's no more room for further action in your understanding, at least, because you say, okay, I found it, I've prioritized it, therefore I'm taking action, and now it's covered. I'm done with this. I keep following up with it in relation to effectiveness assessment, and I'll report on it, but that's it. I might revise my measure later on to look at, after my effectiveness assessment, whether I need to make any changes to it, but you're basically done here.
Yeah, indeed. So again, I think this prioritization also in the context of or against severity, likelihood and reversibility is also crucial, and then to continuously, reflect on the approach going forward based on new information available. There's a question here on also if you have any thoughts or recommendations on how to manage the growing demand on insights from representative organizations like international trade unions, NGOs, etc. So their growing demand that's resulting from the laws, such as the German Act, and if companies should be offering compensation to them.
Oh, this is a really interesting question. I have to say, I haven't really thought about this yet. It's also the first time that I'm hearing that, representative organizations of rights holders might be facing so many demands from obliged companies to get involved with them that they struggle to meet demand, and that this creates considerable expenses. I actually think, from my perspective, but maybe I'm wrong here, that the situation is rather that these organizations are very eager and waiting to be contacted in order to, you know, play their role in this context and do what their purpose is, which is to represent the interests of the rights holder group. When involving them to an extent, for example, when it comes to implementing measures and you're really asking them to take a very active role, and this creates costs that this organization cannot meet, for example, because they have to hire new people who are now taking care of this one specific task. This is something generally where you need to look at covering costs. And when you look at examples, there's a couple of public examples from collaborations of German companies and Save the Children, where in relation to, for example, there's one project between, I think it was Lidl and Save the Children in hazelnut harvest in Turkey, when they wanted to improve the situation of children. They basically started a kindergarten or daycare center, hired social workers and kindergarten teachers to take care of the children of the people who are employed there. And this is something where you really need to look at, okay, this is actually a remedial measure. This is something for which the obliged company has to cover. They need to pay at least a substantial share of the costs, even if they take the NGO on board and build on their expertise. And I don't know exactly how in this example it's you can probably find it online. They've presented on this many times. I don't know how exactly they shared costs between the organization and Lidl, but I believe that Lidl paid a substantial contribution to these activities.
Yeah, and I think it's a great example, or generally there are, you know, these examples out there, and I think it's really just testing new approaches, because there is no kind of one approach to this. It's linked to another comment here or question: who bears the cost of meaningful stakeholder engagement? Time poverty, especially of women workers, is a known reality. Trade unions are often mutually stretched, as are many other legitimate representatives of workers. Indeed, you know, this is all issues. We have kind of covered this question already, so I propose that we don't go much more in detail here for time reasons. But yeah, it's a very valid concern, and I think something that requires just trying new solutions, aligning with other actors to prevent duplication, to just find more efficient approaches to this. The next is also more of a comment than actually a question. A good example: when building and implementing a grievance mechanism, do not only consider consulting potential users, but include them in the design process and rollout, since they are the ones supposed to use it. They define the barriers to access, and they know what they want to use it for, aim for shared ownership. It's spot on. I think it's a very valid point. Indeed, also in the context of the development of our supply chain grievance mechanism, we have done quite some extensive local consultations to ensure that the access channels are actually appropriate and support really access also to vulnerable groups such as migrant workers. All the languages are also in the you know, demographics of the countries and factory landscape that we see within our system. Indeed, it's an absolutely crucial point. So next one here is, as in other international legal frameworks, with free, prior, and informed consent, the big challenge is the authenticity of the consultation. How would you avoid this to be a ticking the box exercise? Very good question. Michaela, if you want to respond to that one.
Yeah, I mean, this indeed is a really good question, and I think this relates back to the criteria of meaningful rights holder engagement that Francis, you spoke about earlier. So you must do it in a way that actually allows for actors to participate, that allows for them to participate in a way that they're not fearful of saying what actually happens. You need to make sure that you're speaking to the right people and not to people that have been put forward, presented to you by someone who might have different interests. Do this in a safe environment where they actually feel confident about talking to you. I know you mentioned a couple of other requirements: ongoing, timely, appropriate, and identify and remove barriers.
Yeah, indeed. And also just on that point of when is it meaningful? I think the impact itself could speak for itself. So if it's a really output-based exercise where you just say, I have trained X amount, okay, it's good, but how has this impacted the situation, for instance, further down the line? So also understanding how the activities that you carry out to meaningfully engage certain stakeholder groups, what do they amount to? Like what's the result? I think that's a good measure. So outcome rather than output. Okay. We are kind of running out of time in this. Questions just keep coming in. So I think we have to maybe pick two more, and then we will slowly draw to a close, just to also give the other speakers a chance to present the tools that they can offer to support you with your stakeholder engagement. So I would say maybe, Michaela, we extend the Q&A until 11. And then we cut the end Q&A a bit shorter. There's so many questions now, so I'll address one or two more, and then we would move on to the next slides. And maybe you can try to answer short and concise. I mean, I know there's a lot to elaborate, but since we have so many questions, maybe we can try to keep it short. So next one would be, how would you practically include potentially affected persons when conducting the risk analysis? It's impossible to talk to a vulnerable group. Is the inclusion of existing and largely known indicators, e.g. on the basis of risk country indicators, sufficient? Michaela.
I mean, in order to do the concrete risk analysis, you will have to not only include, this is for the abstract risk analysis, when you look at country indicators and do desktop research and look at material that's available, but you will also have to do the concrete risk analysis, which forces you to actually look at what's the situation at a specific supplier's level. And when it comes to different methods of the concrete risk analysis, some include rights holder consultations anyways. If you look at how audits can be conducted, in many cases are conducted, as in many contexts, an audit will include speaking to the employees of a specific supplier. And sometimes when done really well, audits will also make sure that they do that in a context where these employees will also feel comfortable in talking about their perspective in relation to the situation. So this is one example of rights holder engagement in the context of the concrete risk analysis. And you don't have to do this in relation to all employees and all vulnerable groups, but if it's a vulnerable group, you should really look at how you can get in touch with them to speak to them, and you should prioritize vulnerable groups and those who are more likely and more likely to be severely affected by a company's activities in their supply chains over engaging with other actors. So you need to kind of take a targeted approach, and after an overall mapping, and to whom are you speaking to?
Yeah, it's kind of, the next question is very similar. So I'll quickly address it, but I think you can maybe complement a little bit, but I think most of it was addressed. So what are good practice examples of conducting engagement with potentially affected rights holders in production countries, for instance, to get deeper insights on a risk topic and what is considered effective mitigation? That part is a bit different. And formats of engagement, selection process for participants, how to ensure continuous two-way dialogue, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, there's many advantages, and I mean the whole reason why rights holder engagement is so central to the Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act is because the act is actually all about protecting their interests, and it's very hard to do that without speaking to them and actually knowing what their interests are and what the actual situation is. And it also is important to give agency to people whom we want to protect with this law, and not just speak about them without actually talking to them and getting them involved in relation to matters that actually concern them and not us so very much. And it's not just an exercise out of principle, because it's the right thing to not be talking about people without talking to them, but it's also, it leads to better results. It's their perspective is key in order to identify risks and violations, in order to identify how you can actually address them appropriately, how to design and implement a complaints procedure. All of this doesn't actually work without getting people on board that you want to protect, that you want to have provide access to with your complaints procedure, and so on.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have to draw the Q&A to a close. You know, there's more questions coming, but I think we need to, you know, move on. We'll try to address them in the chat. So, Michaela, if there's some that you can still answer, that's great. Get the answer in writing. But let's move on to kind of the Amfori toolbox when it comes to stakeholder engagement, involvement of rights holders. So, next slide, please. I will just, you know, illustrate that at the example of the due diligence process. So starting off with really embedding RBC into policies management system. Of course, in that context, stakeholder engagement refers to also your commitment, how you build this commitment with the involvement of certain organizations that may be impacted by you. Starting off, the BSCI Code of Conduct and system include a concrete commitment to meaningful stakeholder engagement and also workers' involvement and protection. That's forms area 2, for example. And then, of course, we have just revised the BSCI Code of Conduct and the system in very close consultation with stakeholders that also represent vulnerable groups, for instance. You know, so we had some women's rights organizations, we had some migrant rights representatives, so as to make sure that really our system is, you know, fully responsive to their needs. So this is for you as a BSCI signatory, of course, good news. When it comes to identifying, assessing adverse impacts, we talked a lot about now also, you know, risk assessment tools. The MVO risk checker, I think, was mentioned. Also, of course, we have our ESG risk identification tool, which is a tool where we collate information from many different organizations that is publicly available to then compile that into some concrete indicators in the environmental, social, and governance domain to give you a certain level of risk for certain countries. This tool will be further evolving over the next years. You know, so we're also working to look into, or we're exploring to link it to other information that we gather, for instance, through audits, through the supply chain grievance mechanism, and so on, whether we can expand to products as well. So that it's, you know, an evolving tool at the moment. This is what it covers, is country risk indicators, and that's what you already have available. Now, of course, for BSA audits include interviews with workers and their representatives. Also, in the context of the audit, it's always required to speak with the segment of vulnerable persons, whether it's women or migrant workers or whatever other vulnerable person category you can think of. Auditors make sure that these are also reflected or heard during the audit. We also experimented with different tools, the worker survey pilot that we rolled out in collaboration with the various other sector initiatives. The report of that was just published recently, so you can have a look at that. We'll share that with you in the chat later on. Also, of course, our supply chain grievance mechanism and our crisis protocol, which enables members to engage with both affected stakeholders or credible proxies. So that's another a critical tool in this regard. When it comes to seizing, preventing, or mitigating adverse impacts, here, of course, the focus is a lot also on your business partners, so supporting business partners through trainings, building their capacity in collaboration with our local partners. Via the Amfori Academy, we have hundreds of trainings available that you can propose to your suppliers for them to take and build their capacity to basically prevent actual adverse impacts from occurring. Also then, of course, providing guidance or guidance on social dialogue that we developed and that we tested and rolled out in a series of dialogues as part of the Shobola project in Bangladesh. In that context, we also carried out various worker trainings. So we trained more than 800 factory workers. And here we felt that what's really key is this close dialogue with the producers' management. So to really make sure that they are fully on board, that they see the value, that they actually shut down the production line, or not shut down the production line, but free those workers from the production line that they're working on to build that awareness. So this is critical to really engage with them. It's that close involvement of the management in this regard. Of course, facilitating cooperation in remediation. So we have our zero tolerance protocol in this regard, as well as the supply chain grievance mechanism, of course. When it comes to tracking implementation and results, here we work with independent remediation partners to verify the effectiveness of remediation measures in consultation with the rights holders. That's, of course, in the context of the supply chain grievance mechanism as well. So here, basically, the complainant is given the chance to basically provide feedback on the draft investigation report and on the final remediation investigation report, and both also on the draft remediation report and the final remediation report. So there's various steps in that process of investigation to remediation where the rights holders are heard. Then when it comes to communicating how impacts are addressed, so here this is something we try to enable through Amfori Insights. So you can use insights to kind of communicate, how your impacts in the supply, where the impacts occur and how they're addressed. And then also you can provide for or cooperate in remediation through, again, the zero tolerance protocol and the supply chain grievance mechanism. So basically the two tools that bring members together, that source from the same supplier, and then we facilitate that dialogue with the supplier and the different companies that source from that supplier to really ensure that the problem is fully understood through a thorough investigation, and that is actually remediated, and that we do in collaboration with our local partners. Now, what I want to also note here is that this graphic includes, of course, examples of stakeholder engagement and involvement of rights holders in the due diligence process, but it's not exhaustive. It includes some examples of how Amfori's tools support, and you can, as a member, of course, make use of those tools. It doesn't constitute an exhaustive list of our offering, nor of course, what our members' activities are in this regard. We will see now from WeFashion also that there's other ways of how they go about this, and that very much complement the approach that they follow with the help of our tools. Next slide, please. And just quickly to drill onto the code of conduct commitment on particularly workers' involvement in protection. So I want to again pay a bit more attention to the rights holders' involvement here, because that's of course a key stakeholder group. So basically what this requirement entails is that the suppliers need to establish good management practice that involve workers and their representatives. So that should be reflected in the management system, in the processes that they have, the management processes. They should define long-term goals for protecting workers in line with the aspirations of the Amfori BSA Code of Conduct. Very importantly, they need to make workers aware of their rights and responsibilities. This is ILO core convention, so legally binding anywhere. So this is an absolutely crucial question that has heavy impact on the weighting or heavy heavily weighted in the rating of the BSCI audits. Then build sufficient competence amongst workers or managers, workers and workers representatives. And then finally, of course, to establish or participate in an effective operational level grievance mechanism for individuals and communities. And this we also, of course, complement through our supply chain grievance mechanism that our members can use. Next slide, please. Just briefly, and then I shut up and move on to WeFashion's presentation. So just in a nutshell here, we have various tools. You can kind of cluster them into 4 categories. Of course, the monitoring tools. So we have a self-assessment questionnaire on workers' involvement and protection, the social audits that verify the performance of the suppliers in this area of workers' involvement and protection. We have various guidance documents, a system manual is an incredibly rich resource for members on how to go about the due diligence in this regard, for business partners on how to actually implement it in their own factories, and then of course for auditors on how to verify these criteria. It's all publicly available, so you can have a look. If you'd like, same as with the guide 4 of the system manual, or specifically on how to set up an effective operational level grievance mechanism. That's of course in line with Article 31 of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights for effective grievance mechanisms. We have developed a deployment guide for business partners to raise awareness amongst workers. So how to go about organizing different kind of sessions and ways, exchange practices on how to do this, and have also actually, carried out many trainings for producers on how to actually do this in practice, and onboarding sessions and so on. We have the supply chain grievance mechanism remediation guide and a social dialogue handbook that you can make use. And many of those guidances are also translated into actual trainings. So we have a training for producers that you can allocate to your producers on workers' involvement and grievance mechanism. We have an e-learning module on access to remedy principles, as well as a continuous improvement through remediation training for both members and business partners. And then finally, we have the supply chain grievance mechanism that I mentioned already a couple of times as a key tool to support businesses in providing access to remedy to workers and communities in their global supply chain. So let's speak for change. And that, of course, is a critical tool to enable workers to make their voice heard. On this note, I'll hand over to Sanne. Sanne, we are very much looking forward to hear a bit more your practical approach. I know you use, of course, Ampuri tools, but as a member, you're obviously not constrained to our toolbox, and we're very much interested to learn how you complement the Ampuri offering with other ways, or how the Ampuri offering, of course, also plays a role in your approach. And yeah, Sanne, the floor is yours. Looking forward to hear from you.
Thank you, Francis, and hello everyone. Very shortly, my name is Sanne Gerritsen, and I'm the Social Compliance Coordinator for WeFashion. For those who don't know us, we are a Dutch brand and retailer. We sell men's, women, and children's clothing in around 120 stores in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Switzerland, but we also have an online presence in the rest of Europe via our own website and our online partners such as Zalando. Well, I can mention to you why stakeholder engagement is important to us, but I think Michaela and Francis already really pointed it out, and as fellow brands, I think you also understand the importance of this concept. So more importantly, in the chat, I saw a question on what are some practical examples, and therefore would like to move on to our practical approach, because to be fair, there's not one approach. You can only address this in a mix of tools. So we combine different tools because there is no one size fits all. And also there are so many different things you want to reach when you think about, oh, there's the line again. When you think about stakeholder engagement. So you have the expanding of the voice of workers, creating awareness of rights, enhancing social dialogue, expanding on ways to raise issues, etc. There's so many different things that you want to approach. So I will just briefly go through some of these examples, which the first one would be expanding the voice of workers during audits. it was already mentioned in one of the questions that engaging with workers can actually be a big issue for them as well, because they are suffering from time poverty. And I think standardizing or using actually the tools we already have, such as audits, and then adding to those to make it more standardized to speak or to engage the workers would be a way to address actually this time poverty. So what we're doing is we've started a pilot with worker voice surveys. And what will happen during the audit, workers will fill out a survey, and they can do this on their phones or by actually calling or using a QR code or whatever fits the actual worker group that we're working with at that point. And they can just add their own experience regarding actually performance areas of the BSCI or the SMETA audit. And we started a pilot with Lula, who is a partner that I think all of the foreign members already know. They are also working on the Speak for Change program, and they are very experienced in surveys such as this. And we're starting this in Turkey, and they are now looking to expand this tool to really engage more with the workers. And what it does is it gives extra information for the auditors to go on throughout the audit, but also at the end, we will give a more aggregated report of the findings to our suppliers and discuss with them what we have found and what workers are actually pointing out. So this would be one of the examples that we use to really engage worker voices. But if we go on to the next tool, this will address creating more awareness of their rights and enhancing social dialogue. And one of the projects that we do regarding social dialogue is called Amplify. And we're working with the FMV International as our partner, as well as with different brands. We started with a training of trainers to really expand on this tool, to not just have it as a one-off time, because I think that's what a lot of brands are also see as a challenge for us as well. You can do one small little project and then move on to the next thing, but it's not really doing anything as a whole for your supply chain. So we really looked at a project that we can expand to different suppliers, and we started with one of our top suppliers in Bangladesh and see how this works. And so far, we're very happy about this approach, and looking forward to see what else it can do. And then obviously, there's also a big question on how workers can raise their issues. I'm not going to expand on this too much because Francis already mentioned the Speak for Change program. But for those who don't know, it's a grievance mechanism that workers can use in factories that are linked to the BSCI audits. The first round was done in Vietnam, which was a huge success. And now we're actually rolled out to Bangladesh and looking to also different countries such as India, Cambodia, etc. It's available for all workers, so you really see a broader engagement. And I think what makes this really strong is that it, as a result, always come back to a platform for collective action between brands. So we're not all doing our own part and we're all figuring out the same thing, but we can actually do it together. Which brings me to the last point, which is sector-wide engagement. So we're really trying to get engaged with all stakeholders, which is also the different brands and the NGOs and the trade unions. It's important to stay informed. We cannot be present in all the factories that we're working with at the same time, so we really need each other. And I think in the chat, I saw a question about stakeholder fatigue, and I think this is a really big issue when you're talking about stakeholder engagement, because we can all talk to each other and have all these separate conversations, but having actual meaningful stakeholder engagement also means that you have to build trust and accessibility and a safe environment, and that takes time. So if we find each other to do that, and if we find collective action to do this, it really takes down the stakeholder fatigue by looking at collective action and standardization. So I think I'm really trying to keep this short because I know we're really short in time, and I know the next presentation is also really, really helpful for us as brands. But to really combine it, there isn't one approach, and we just have to try to find different things. And I think brands can help each other really doing this. We've done it during the Amplify project, for example. We didn't look at what can we do, but what can we do together with different brands. I know some of you are in this call as well. And there are still so many remaining issues, such as who are the right stakeholders? How can we engage with them? How can we inform to be what's out there? And I actually think the only solution to all these questions is to really stay engaged with each other as well, and not only look at what is my supply chain doing, but what can we as a sector do together.
Thank you so much, Sanne. Just a quick additional remark on the supply chain grievance mechanism. Indeed, it's available in Vietnam, also in Turkey, and indeed also is being rolled out as we speak in Bangladesh and India. So it will be very soon available in these 4 major sourcing countries for our members, and with the long-term objective, of course, to scale it also to other countries. Now handing over to Isabel Reichenbach, Project Manager at the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, and she will give an overview of the German PST's approach to the topic. Isabel, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, and hello everyone. I'm gonna guide you through these last 10 minutes of today's webinar. For those of you who don't know, the partnership advocates for a social, environmental, and corruption-free textile and garment industry, and as a multi-stakeholder initiative brings together stakeholders from the private sector, civil society, and the German government. So I think also quite, fitting to today's topic. It means that, by nature, we do bring together various stakeholders within this platform, and also what Sanne just highlighted, try and provide the platform for these stakeholders to engage. Maybe the next slide. We talked about the due diligence, the cycle quite detailed, or also what are the expectations. And please allow me to highlight 3 areas of our work. But before doing so, what is important is to mention that in 2022 and now basically implemented in 2023, what we did within the partnership is we really decided to put more to put a greater focus basically on achieving impact on the ground that benefit, but then also involve those that are potentially affected by the actions in the production countries. Next slide, please. I already said that, by nature, as a multi-stakeholder initiative, we bring together different stakeholders. But then I also don't want to lie, and I think that what we noticed throughout, or at the beginning of the year, also last year, is that we can do more when it comes to also engaging rights holders within our work. So what we did in for example, this April in one of our member meetings, is we invited representatives from Bangladesh and India to especially talk on worker-centered instruments. And we see kind of this event also as a kickoff, so to say, in order to strengthen the perspective of rights holders in our work. And then also, I think, adding to what Francis said about the Amphori tools and the partnership, is a bit different. We don't have an instrument such as the BCI, but what we also do is we provide a number of trainings or guidance that are also addressed at the partners within the supply chain. Then next slide, please. I'm also trying to keep it short and rushing a bit through, but I want to have time for maybe some questions. So I said before that we really put a focus on of projects of joint action. This is where we provide the infrastructure as the partnership, but also if certain criteria are met, public sector contributions, and this is also where rights holders play a key role. For example, one project that we're gonna implement is on advancing worker-led agreements on gender justice that aims at gender-based violence and harassment and intersectional discrimination in the garment factories involved in these projects, which will be in India, and that really puts the perspective and the voice of rights holders in focus. And then Next slide. Yes, thank you. Also, I mentioned this in a couple of previous webinars, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this either. We do not operate as the partnership our own grievance mechanism, but what we do is that we work with other partners within the community. So, for example, with Amfori, but also with Fairware Foundation, where we have a certain protocol in place that deals with complaints from shared factories, but then also greater collaboration with other MSI like Fair Labor Association or ETI in order to identify synergies and potentials for harmonization. So generally speaking, I think just also the invitation for you to have a look at the partnership if you're interested in a structured and continuous exchange with stakeholders, and then also strengthened exchange with rights holders in the future. With that, before turning to the closing remarks, I think I'm going to have a look at the at some of the questions, if there's some still in the chat. I think Sanne, one was directed at you that I thought was interesting, but maybe you already answered. It was on, I think, how do you kind of maybe how do you in your pilots measure the success of the engagement? So I think maybe, or I think it was directed at Sanne. Maybe it was also directed at Francis. Francis, you answered, but is this something you want to elaborate on?
That's actually not a really easy answer. Easy question to answer when you look at meaningful stakeholder engagement, right? Because I think Michaela already pointed out that who do we have to talk to, and when is an engagement meaningful? And that's in this case really hard to measure if our pilots are successful. However, what we do is we find some KPIs that you can measure, which would be engagement in numbers, but also if we find issues that weren't flagged by our other approaches, such as audits or interviews.
Thank you. I think looking at the time, because we want to do these closing remarks and leave you with, also some perspective on why we think this topic is important. We will have a look at the questions that are still there and try to answer some of them afterwards. So first of all, I would like to thank Amfori, Francis, and Michaela from Help Desk for this another insightful webinar. And also, Sanne, thank you so much for sharing what you're doing. When we picked this topic, I think we all agreed that it's such an important topic, but then also knowing from talking to many of you is that some companies are not quite there yet, or have their issues to address this topic. And we also saw that in today's question, a lot of questions coming up on how to do that in a meaningful way, in a structured way. I really also found the question on how to avoid I think it was called like stakeholder fatigue really interesting, and I think it's something that we can maybe also follow up upon. And then, yes, turning to, or maybe, kind of sending you off with these remarks. I think, Michaela, you already mentioned some of them also in your presentation or in your remarks. Is we heard what is expected of companies when it comes to stakeholder and rights holder engagement. So what is expected also under the German Supply Chain Act, but also expected, from the OECD Due Diligence Guidance, that really also says that stakeholder engagement matters in every step, basically, of a company's due diligence. And why this is important is, it helps you as companies to close information gaps, to increase your ability, to identify and address actual and potential adverse impacts. And I'm just gonna pick some of the bullets we have here. It really strengthens the effectiveness of your due diligence processes. Is such an important argument when we also talk about prioritizing. So where do you really start with your measures? Which risks or also adverse potential impacts do you address? And maybe a last one is that it builds a resilient supply chain and reduces costs from supply chain disruptions. 1 minute left, and I really wanted to highlight one event that we are hosting at the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles together with our GIZ colleagues from the Green Button. It's a webinar series on the Europe's green transition in the textile sector, so basically on the upcoming EU legislation. I'm going to post the link to register here in the chat, and then also next slide, highlighting maybe Francis, I'm just gonna do it. Also pointing out this Amphori event that's taking place from 6th to 7th November in Berlin, from CSR to ESG due diligence. So also please register and feel invited to this event. And then one last slide. We're also going to post the link to the survey here. It's from the Social and Economic Council of the Netherlands, who are developing tools and products for companies to support them in engaging meaningfully with their stakeholders, and they are interested to hear your insights. So please take part in this survey. Francis just posted the link. With this, I'm gonna leave you. We're looking forward. There are going to be more webinars, and the next one is supposed to happen in October. We keep you posted, and hopefully send you the invitation soon. Thank you very much for participating, and the great questions that came in today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.